All right, hey everybody. This is an introduction to static site generators for Drupalists. I am Brian Perry. I am really excited to be here at NetCamp because I am from Cranston, Rhode Island. Yes! Went to Cranston High School West. There's the logo that I pulled off of their website with their surprisingly kind of aggressive new slogan, give, get, respect. I'm not sure what the deal with that is, but yeah. So I am a front-end developer at Bounteous. I live in the Chicago area, but I'm from Rhode Island. That's my wife and I at the Bears-Patriots game a few weeks ago, which ended up very nicely for the Patriots fans that were around, but not necessarily the Bears fans. But it was a great game. And then I am a lover of all things components and component-driven and building with components in Drupal, design systems, pattern lab, and tools like that, and also increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. And I also am a huge fan of all things Nintendo, so if you want to talk about the cool games you're playing on your Switch, I'm always down to do that. And also very interested in the Jamstack and new stacks and new options that potentially take us away from the traditional LAMP stack, static options, things like that, which obviously we'll be talking about today. And I am on the internet in a variety of different places and would love to internet with you. So I work at a company called Bounteous. We recently rebranded and changed our name. If you've seen me talk before, a company formerly known as HS2 Solutions. But Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do. But I get to work with a bunch of great Drupal folks, learn cool, amazing stuff from them. And I would just say that in general, if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we're often hiring. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I'm sure I can get you in touch with somebody.
Remote?
We do have remote employees, yep. And we have, at this point, a handful of different offices. So there may be a local option for you that is not Chicago, potentially. So, static site generators. So we're going to look at this from a Drupal perspective and look at a few specific options. But first, just want to talk about them in general. So this is a screenshot of a static site. This is the Space Jam website, one of the most important websites on the internet, obviously. And so this, it's possible that maybe back in the day when the site was actually built, there was some sort of CMS-like thing driving it. I'm not so sure. I doubt it. But at the very least, what was that?
GeoCity?
Yeah, right. But definitely now, this site is still live, but this is definitely just a static version of this page with its markup and images and WAV files. And then this is also a static site. This is the React docs. It happens to be a Gatsby site, I believe. And Gatsby is one of the options we'll be looking at. But it's documentation, but the whole thing is static and pre-built. And then also kind of, maybe changing the way you think about static sites. This is also a static site, probably a mostly static site. There's probably a few features on this that might hit APIs for different visualizations. But this also is a Gatsby example. But this is a statically built site, built with Gatsby. And it doesn't have to be the Space Jam website, basically, is what we're trying to get across here. So, what is those are static sites. So, what is a static site generator? So, it's a tool that builds a completely static version of your site. It spits out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript based on raw data that you provide it. And what that data is can vary a bit. It's often Markdown for a lot of these modern static site generator tools, at least as like a default. But it can almost be anything. It could be a database. It could hit an API. You could get stuff out of a CSV file or flat files. and they're typically going to use some sort of templating engine. So you can adjust your markup and create templates that all the data gets passed into. And that templating engine will vary based on the tool. And also, because really what your site is just those static assets, it kind of changes the game as far as hosting, and you don't need your full LAMP stack, for example, and really opens up the options as far as where you can put these sites, potentially the cost, how you can scale them, things like that. And there are tons and tons of static site generator options and projects. Jekyll is a very popular, modern, somewhat recent one that a lot of people are familiar with. Hugo, Hexo are similar in ways to Jekyll. There's also Gatsby, which is a React-based static site generator. We'll look at that one as well. But there are tons of them. So the ones that we're going to look at today are just kind of, in some ways, representative. But if there's another option that you like or is great for you, totally fine by me, man. So this is just kind of, again, thinking of the pieces of the puzzle here a little bit. So you have your data, and what that is can vary quite a bit depending on the tool or depending on your needs. And then you have your static site generator tool that takes that data and then spits out the static build, just a bunch of assets, and then you're going to host that somewhere. Ideally, it would be on a CDN, something nice and fast. But at the end of the day, pretty much any host can take HTML and CSS and serve that up for you. So, and I think we've even kind of touched on some of these things already, but like, what are some of the potential advantages here? Speed is one of them. Browsers are really good at rendering HTML. You can take advantage of CDNs. There's also the security angle on this. So your static build, there are certainly fewer attack vectors there. Also, thinking of it from like the Drupal perspective, your Drupal site only needs to exist at build time, and it could be completely local, or it could be hosted somewhere and it's walled off, or you could spin it up and spin it down during builds. But when the next big major security patch comes through, you're still going to want to install it, but it takes some of the pressure off if your site isn't actually accessible. And then also, we talked about the hosting stuff kind of already. Simplifies the stack quite a bit. Really opens up your options to scale up and scale down as you need. And then also, depending on the tool, potentially, there's also some potential advantages for developer experience. If, again, really it's during build time that you just need this data, it's potentially a lot easier to spin up a site or to get your developers access to the data that drives your static build. But we're at a Drupal camp here. We all love Drupal. So you might be asking yourself, why would I use one of these things? I have Drupal. Drupal makes websites. So there's some reasons from a Drupal perspective as well. Avoiding caching hell. One of my coworkers gave a little internal talk recently about escaping from caching hell. So I love the phrase caching hell these days. But and this is something that I have run into recently with deployments for sites that I've been working on. But think of all the things that we do to make it so that our Drupal sites, at the end of the day, are as close to static as possible. Right, where we might have varnish up in front of it using memcache. There's all of Drupal's caches. It gets complicated, and really, what it feels like we're doing there is trying to make this as close to a static site as possible for as many people as possible, as many visitors as possible. We talked about security, so I think that's kind of been covered off already. Hosting as well, so your Drupal site, in that case, it's just the admin experience that you need to have the hosting for, not necessarily all of your end users if the static build is separate from Drupal. And then this might not be necessarily what jumps to mind right away for us, but Drupal's admin UI is also a reason that you might use Drupal with a static site generator. I know that we Many of us know that there are improvements that can be made in Drupal's admin UI, but depending on the tool that you're using, it may not have an admin UI at all, or it may have one that is not as good as Drupal's. So that can be an advantage there also. And also, the general content editing experience as well is kind of lumped in there. So now we're going to take a look at the static site generator landscape from a Drupal perspective. And again, there are so many different options. Whatever flavor you may want, whatever fancy name you may want, it is out there. And they all do, it's all the same general concept. But we're going to look at 3 examples that kind of cover a decent amount of ground, and then I think also approach this in some slightly different and interesting ways. So we're going to look at JEKYLL, GATSBY, and TOME. So let's dive right in and start. So we're going to start with JEKYLL, which is kind of the, at least from my perspective anyway, the granddaddy of modern static site generators. This, for me, was the thing that introduced me to this general static build concept and sucking in markdown content. So it's a Ruby project, and that may immediately tell you everything that you need to know about whether or not you will like JEKYLL. I'm not really a Ruby guy myself, but it uses a templating engine called Liquid. When I first used JEKYLL, it was kind of a little bit weird and foreign to me. But now it almost feels like a lot of these templating engines, although they might be different, they all kind of feel the same at the end of the day. It feels even a little twig-like in some places. It definitely relies on Markdown. I personally don't use JEKYLL a ton so much anymore these days, but there might be some other weird ways around this. But at the end of the day, what JEKYLL does is it looks at Markdown. So you have to get the content that you want to use with JEKYLL in Markdown somehow. It also kind of introduced, or at least introduced to me, like the concept here of having your content in version control, because it's all of the Markdown that can go in a GitHub repo. It's also supported natively by GitHub Pages and a handful of other things. But I think that really helped its popularity and adoption. You can actually just deploy a JEKYLL site to GitHub, and it'll do the build, and you can pick different themes. It supports incremental builds as well, which not all of these tools do. And depending on the volume you have, that can be important. And it's also really popular, I think partially because of its GitHub support that really helped there. Yes?
What's an incremental build?
Yeah, so you think about the data that you have that's going to feed your static build. The tool may just have to run through all of your data and look at everything to create a build. An incremental build, it knows, all right, I've already built based on these 100 Markdown files. There's only this one that has changed, and it will just build what changed. So, depending on the volume of your content, depending on the complexity of your build, that can help a lot. So, just looking at the process to install and run JEKYLL, I really love the, as someone who's not a Ruby guy, I love the first step here. Install a full Ruby development environment, which links off to a completely different page. That's going to be fun. But with your Ruby environment up and running, you need to install JEKYLL and Bundler, and then you can run JEKYLL new and then the name of your project, which will scaffold a JEKYLL project for you. And then in there you can run bundle exec JEKYLL serve, and that's going to do your build. It's going to launch a little dev web server, and it's also going to watch for changes. So here's a look at example data. This actually is the example Markdown content that is just in the default install. So up at the top, I mean, I'd imagine a lot of us are probably familiar with Markdown at this point, but there's, I always forget what that's called.
Front
matter, yes. Yeah, front matter. For the front matter at top that has like the specifies the layout that you're using, title, date, tagging, things like that. So that's metadata that Jekyll's going to use. And then the rest is just Markdown. Pretty typical Markdown. There are a few Jekyll-specific or maybe like Ruby-specific things that it can take advantage of, like the code highlighting. But at the end of the day, it's Markdown. And then here's a look at what a template is going to look like. There are a bunch of themes you can install, but it's pretty easy to override them. So you just create, a copy of the template in your code base. And here, the only thing that's changed in this template is for the post. It's just slicing kind of a teaser of it. But you can just see the structure of it. There's markup, some liquid-specific tags and templates there, but probably stuff that a lot of us are comfortable with and familiar with. And let's talk a little bit about using it with Drupal. So I don't really use Jekyll that much anymore. Getting prepped for this talk, I found that there really doesn't seem to be a lot of formal options to use it with Drupal 8. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's somebody around here who does use it with Drupal 8 and has the magic bullet. But there are importers for Drupal 6 and Drupal 7. So I'd imagine if you really like using Jekyll and want to use it with Drupal 8, it would be reasonable to write an importer to do that. But without it, how could you handle it? You could create a process that exports your data to Markdown, because that's what it wants at the end of the day. But there's also a handful of other importers that you can probably use as a stopgap. There's an RSS importer, so you can create a feed and use that. For the examples that I was playing around with, I actually just used the CSV importer. So I installed views data export, exported a CSV with all the nodes. In the examples that we're going to be looking at, I just used the Umami demo profile. So just exported the articles and recipes into a CSV. And then you can run this fun Ruby command that just looks at your CSV and spits out a bunch of Markdown files. All roads lead to Markdown with Jekyll. And so I definitely did not spend any time trying to put bells and whistles here, but you're going to get, this is just with its default theme, a nice static output of your data, these Umami articles in this case. And it's just a nice, clean, static build. And you could change your themes or do custom templating if you wanted to. I certainly didn't take the time and effort to do that, given my personal stance on Jekyll. So I think Jekyll would be for you if you want. Oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I've been using Jekyll recently, and I can just say, like my personal blog, I have a mix of Markdown and HTML. HTML files are fine.
Yep.
It loves HTML too, so it doesn't have to be Markdown.
Yeah.
But if you want your content to be semantic free, so that you can choose a Markdown parser that'll do something different, Markdown is a nice way to go.
Yeah, that's actually a good distinction. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a Markdown file, but it doesn't have to be explicitly Markdown. And technically, HTML is valid Markdown. So yeah, but it could just be a file that is all HTML. Like here in my little Jekyll demo here, I think I have the posts in here. So these are just from the CSV. It is a Markdown file, but it's really just the HTML from the body field.
Because of the front matter that you need at the top, probably it's considered a Markdown file.
Yeah, and it also has the file extension Markdown.
Yep.
Yep. But yeah, that's a good distinction. Yeah, at the end of the day, you can just jam a bunch of HTML in this file too. Okay, so yeah, I think Jekyll would be for you if you want a simple, straightforward, extremely road-tested option. Jekyll kind of, in a lot of ways, popularized this, and has been used by tons and tons of people, tons and tons of sites. You're all in on Markdown or some variant on Markdown. GitHub Pages integration is desirable to you, and you also don't hate Ruby.
What do you got against Ruby?
So, yeah.
I'm kidding, that was rhetorical.
The next time, maybe I shouldn't beat up on Ruby so much, but the reason that I don't like Ruby is because I don't want to introduce it into my stack. There's already enough going on. And, I'm doing a lot of things with like NPM dependencies and stuff, and I don't want another package manager that I'm not as comfortable with. That's why. Really, at the end of the day, the reason that I hate Ruby is because it makes me feel dumb. Which maybe isn't the right way to look at things. But, just some simple resources here. Obviously, there's the Jekyll docs. All the examples that we're looking at have a nice solid documentation. There's so the current media current site, I believe, is a Jekyll site using Drupal 8. Actually, I should track somebody down and hear exactly how they did their export. But they have a nice blog post on how they put it together and the structure there and some of the challenges they faced. So worth a read if you're interested. Similar projects, there's Hexo, which is a node static site generator that's similar to Jekyll in a lot of ways. I've used that before. It's pretty nice. There's Hugo, which is a Go-based option. It's also pretty popular, and I think one of its selling points is that it's really fast, and also I think can do incremental builds as part of that. So those are worth checking out, but they're kind of in the same neighborhood as Jekyll. So on to Gatsby. Gatsby is a React project, and their pitch, which has evolved a little bit, is that Gatsby can be used to build blazing fast apps and websites with React. I think they used to say that it was a blazing fast static site generator. And they're making the distinction that it's not just for static sites, which is true. At the end of the day, it's a React project. It can build you a really awesome static site, but you could also use it for like a single page app or a project that has a lot of static content and some traditional React content as well. So yeah, it's a React project. From a templating perspective, it uses JSX, although calling it templating is kind of weird. We'll look at some examples. It's almost kind of a little bit more than that because they're React components. It uses GraphQL to structure queries to get at the data. And it has a really thriving, large plugin ecosystem. So there's just plugins in general, cool things that you can add to your Gatsby site. But there's also what they call source plugins. So those are existing plugins that allow you to work with a bunch of different data sources. It is also the new hotness. Especially at like Badcamp a few weeks ago, there was a tremendous amount of Gatsby content. People in the Drupal community are really excited about it. And it is really, really, really fast. Who here has used Gatsby or a Gatsby site? Couple people. I'll actually show an example just because I think unless you've seen it or used it, it's a little bit hard to understand like what that means. Like it's fast in a way that is kind of shocking or off-putting. And it's not just for static sites, as I mentioned. So it can make a really awesome static site, but it also is just React at the end of the day. So let's look at installing and running Gatsby. So you can install with NPM or Yarn the Gatsby CLI globally. And then you can run Gatsby new and then the name of your Gatsby project. And then in that directory that gets created for you, you can run Gatsby develop. And that's going to do a build, a development build, and start up a local web server. And also do all of your fun, fancy React hot module reloading. So as you make changes in code, or even for some data, but not all data, if your data changes, the updates will be automatically reflected in your browser. So it's a nice dev experience there. And then if you run Gatsby build, it's going to create a production optimized bundle of your site, which you can go host anywhere. You can also run Gatsby serve, and that is going to start a little web server looking at your production build. And I've run into cases where that's been important, where in development, my dev build looked fine, but then I had errors with my production build. So if you don't check it, you're rolling the dice. And then also, there are a handful of starters. So, they're like themes or general project structures. So you could install with a starter as well. And just thinking about the data a little bit, this is an image from the Gatsby site that I think explains it pretty well. But with all the different source plugins, you can have a lot of different data sources that all feed into your Gatsby project. And you can use them together. And it all kind of becomes things that you can query with GraphQL on your React project. So it has a lot of really interesting applications as far as using different sets of data together that, at least from my experience, some of the other static site generator tools are not necessarily as well suited to do. And at the end of the day, it just gives you your nice production build that you can host on a CDN somewhere. And yeah, about the data source plugins, so that works with a bunch of different CMSs, can work with a database, can work with flat files. There's tons and tons of options there. So let's look at the data, a couple of different examples. Again, there's a lot of different things that can serve as your data, but it could just be a React component. You can actually just in like the pages subdirectory here, create a React component that just spits out JSX, which is going to be markup at the end of the day. So you could just write a component that ends up being a statically generated page. And there may be some cases where that you might want to do that, and it would just be really quick and easy. Then you could also use Markdown. So Markdown, again, is a really common option with a lot of these tools. So this is the Gatsby config.js file where you define your plugins, but just showing an example. So the Gatsby source file system plugin lets you look at files in your file system and use those as data. So it specifies the directory that it's going to look for files in your file system. And then the next one, Gatsby transformer remark. That remark is a markdown library. So it takes the files from your file system and the things that are markdown. It structures your markdown data nicely so you can query it. And there's a bunch of other like cool markdown related plugins and tricks you can do. And then there's also a little query environment, GraphQL, I don't know how you're supposed to say it, but it's a really nice place where you can structure your queries, because in a lot of your templates, you'll be defining GraphQL queries. We'll look at that in a second, actually. But it's a great place where you can experiment and see what data you have available to. It does nice auto-suggest, so you can see what fields are there, see an example of the data you're going to get back. It's good for just figuring out the data that you want available to your components, but also for somebody like me who's not super experienced with GraphQL. I don't think I'd be able to even make something without this. And then the templating. And templating is in quotes here because it's a React component, so there's a lot more than just the JSX template structure that's in this file. But so this is the using Drupal example, which creates a site that uses the Umami data and builds a site that looks kind of like the Umami demo profile. But you import your React components, and then there is the JSX markup that is actually going to render your component. But at the bottom, which is potentially the most important part, is your GraphQL query here. So this is a recipe component, and this is what all of your recipe data is going to be rendered in. So you define a query in GraphQL to get the data that you want to use in this component. So here we're getting all of the recipes, or at least up to 1,000 of the recipes. And then the markup is going to iterate through it and list out all of the recipes, so you can have recipe links and everything. So again, like there's more than just markup in this file. So it's a bit of a stretch to refer to it as templating. And obviously, comparing this with Jekyll, there's a whole lot more going on here, and a whole lot more than can go on here. So that could be good, that could be bad. Kind of depends on what you're looking to do. Now let's talk about it from the Drupal perspective a little bit. So there's a plugin, Gatsby source Drupal, and that is intended to be used with a site that has JSON API enabled. And so in the plugin section, you define the base URL, and you can define the API endpoint. There's like a default as well. And what it does with that is during the build process, it hits that API, and it actually just sucks in all of the data from your Drupal site and makes that available so you can query it and add it to your components. Kyle, one of the Gatsby leads, I think actually in one of his talks, he kind of referred to it as this, and right now this is kind of what it does. It's really as if it's just taking like a little local copy of all of the data from your Drupal site and then making that available to Gatsby, which again, depending on the volume of your data, could be an issue. But the cool thing is that there's a really low effort way to get all of the data, as long as you have JSON API enabled, available to play with in Gatsby. And then you can query it, like that example there. You'll have all the things that you expect. It can even have referenced entities, and during the build process, it's going to find like file entities, like images, and take a local copy of that image and do image manipulation on it. So, excuse me. The image is not on your Drupal site. It's not referencing the image on your Drupal site. It will have like responsive versions of your images and stuff like that. So this is the using Drupal example that has all the umami recipe data. This is probably a good time to go click around on a Gatsby site. Where are we here? Okay, so this is that same site. I'll reload it. You'll see that there's a nice little image scaling effect where they blur in. And then as you click around, it's really, really, really fast. Essentially instantaneous when you click to different pieces of content. And like my blog, one of the least important sites on the internet, is a Gatsby site. And like I have pagination here. And as I click through the pagination, it's all just instantly there. And the way that it does that, I won't really get into the details, but it does a lot of really intelligent things with preloading. So it, as data is like available on the page, like the next most likely things that you're going to click on, it preloads all the data for that. So when you click on the link, it's already there. It preloads images as they're about to go into the viewport, like all sorts of great stuff like that you get out of the box. But yeah, it's so fast that it kind of feels weird the first time you click through a Gatsby site. Okay, so yeah, a lot of chat about Gatsby, but Gatsby I think would be for you if you prioritize performance, and performance is really important to you. It's going to be super fast. Another way I've heard them talk about it is that like the default state of a Gatsby site is really fast and performant, and you have to work hard to undo that, which sounds pretty nice. If you like React and think in React or React components, this obviously would be a great option. You want flexibility in the data that's part of your static build, or if GraphQL is attractive to you, so if you want to be able to have power on the front end to be able to define the data that is part of your build in GraphQL queries, that can be great. Also, if you just like new, exciting, new hotness, this is a good option too. And also the fact that it can be used for things that are beyond static sites also can be attractive too. So some resources. Gatsby also has a bunch of great documentation. I have done a few talks and a few blog posts on this, specifically around the challenges that I've run into using the Gatsby source Drupal plugin. It does a lot of great things out of the box, but then some things like image handling and some things that you might expect that you could easily do coming from the Drupal world was a little trickier than I expected. Although it seems like lately in the community there's been some improvements there. But worth checking out if you want to know more there. And I didn't even list them out. There are so many different talks and tutorials and blog posts. There's a lot of content out there on Drupal and Gatsby. I trust you will be able to find it. Similar projects, there's VuePress, which is a Vue.js-based static site generator. Next.js is another React-based framework that can do static builds. I've never really used it, but I think it's in the same neighborhood. And then there's the static site generator Webpack plugin, which I think Gatsby is kind of built on top of. So that's another way that you could do static-based React builds. So last but not least, we're going to look at Tome, which is a Drupal project. This is another kind of interesting take on building a static site. So it's a Drupal-based static site generator, and it also is a static content storage system. It kind of does two things in pursuit of giving you a static build of your Drupal site. So it's going to generate a static site that looks exactly like your Drupal site. And it also can be used to import and export your content as flat files, as JSON. And I think the plan, the maintainer is actually going to split out those two aspects of it into two modules, because you may actually just want to use this to export your data and import it. So you can have, similar like the Markdown stuff that we looked at, you can have your content be something that's in version control, and you can import and export without requiring a database. Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. So here's how you would install and run it. So there's a starter project that you could use. So you can do composer create project to install it that way. And then after that, you run drush tome init. And that is going to create, it's going to export all of the content in the site and do a static build. Or you could use it in an existing project. You need to install the Tome module and then the Tome drush plugins. Enable Tome, and then you can run drush tome export. And that, again, exports all the data. And then you can run drush tome static, which is going to run a build. And it also will, again, launch like a little dev server for you. So here's what the data looks like. It's a JSON file that just has all of the, big object that has all of the data from Drupal. So that's what it uses to create this build. And again, it lets you kind of import and export and suck that in across different installs. Another kind of interesting application of this is you could use this outside of Tome if you wanted to. Having this like middle step doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but I've seen people actually use it as a data source for Gatsby, another way to get your data into Gatsby using Gatsby's like just JSON source plugin. And templating, it's Drupal. It uses Twig. It's all the Drupal stuff that you know and love. And the output is going to be your Drupal site. So, again, if you use this with the Umami install profile, you're still going to have your admin UI and your Umami site. And then when you export it, it's just going to give you a static version that looks and behaves exactly the same, which is, what you want. And you have all those assets and images, and you can post it and host it anywhere, just like with all these other options. So Tome is for you if you want to know and love and want to keep using the tools that are provided by Drupal. You want to get Drupal content under version control. And again, there's some interesting applications where you could use this flat file data outside of Drupal in some interesting ways. A lot of great hmms on this one. It's cool. This is a cool project, especially from the Drupal perspective. They have documentation, and it's not really additional resources, more of like a next step kind of thing. But if you're interested in this, pull it down and try it out on one of your example sites. See how it works. I'm sure the maintainers would love to see issues where this kind of runs into data problems and things like that. because it is still relatively new. There's also some similar projects. There's a static generator project for Drupal 8 that kind of aims to do the same thing, a static export of your Drupal site. And then as far as the data import and export, there's the default content module and then the YAML content module that conceptually do some similar things. So those are the three that we looked at, but as far as like how they relate to Drupal 8, it's just interesting that all three of them at the end of the day just give you a really fast, performant, static build of a site, but they all approach it in such different, sometimes complementary ways. And that's just three of the billions of options that were on that static gen site. So a few other odds and ends to talk about here. One is automating deployments. So, I updated my Drupal content. Nothing happened. Now what? So before we look at some of those options there, I'm actually just going to, so this is my blog. So I just have an example post here where I uploaded a photo of the gigantic piece of chicken parm I ate last night. So I'm going to publish that post and save it here. And this is a Contenta install that has the JSON API enabled. And then we'll see why that's relevant in a second. So build process. So you can just run the build process using any of these tools and just take your static asset, commit it, and push it somewhere. For my site right now, the production version of my blog is just on GitHub pages. So that's what I do. Run the build, commit everything, push it up, and then GitHub pages host it. Ta-da. And that can certainly work. Then also, for a number of these modern hosting options, this is a screenshot from Netlify. Netlify is a great option for a lot of these static site generators, but there's a host of other options as well. But you can trigger a build with a commit. So they can be aware of like a JEKYLL, but definitely like they work with Gatsby. And if there's a commit in your repo on a specific branch that you dictate, it will then run the build process on your hosting for you. So instead, just like a code change will be what triggers the build. Then alternatively, on the Drupal side, you could trigger a build with a webhook. So again, Netlify and a handful of different options offer webhooks. So just a URL that you can post to, and when you post that, it will trigger a build based on a specific branch. So I actually wrote a small module that I posted for the webhooks for Netlify, but then found that there's a webhooks module that kind of does everything I needed it to and a little bit more. So you can provide your webhook URL. It does outgoing and also incoming webhooks. I haven't really done much with the incoming yet. But then you specify like what entity and what event on the entity is going to trigger the webhook. My only issue with the webhook module is it hasn't been updated in quite a while, so I wonder what the status of the project is. But what's there now does what I needed to. So the idea there is that if you save a node in Drupal, it'll trigger a build. And that is why I went and saved my blog before that so I could show it. Why can I not see my cursor? What is going on? I can now. All right, cool. All right, so this is Netlify. And so if I click on this, this is the current production build here. This is just a clone of my site in Netlify. But if I go into deploys, we'll see here that at 12:11, when I saved that node, it started a build process. It took 2 minutes. I've got my full deploy log here, and then I can go preview it, see my fancy chicken parm from last night, which, I really wish I took the rest of it home, but I didn't. And then, so I can, check the build, make sure it's good to go, and then publish it. So now if I go to my main site, I see that new post, all just triggered by saving the node in Drupal. So there's a lot of options to kind of improve and ease that process. And then challenges. It's obviously also important to talk about the challenges here. There are reasons that this might not be practical for you or your project. And I find that when people, especially coming from like a Drupal perspective, when they first start thinking about this, their brain just thinks about the dynamic nature of Drupal sites in a specific way, and it's pretty easy to think that it's just not possible for you. In some cases, I think it's your preconceived notions. In other cases, it just, might not be right for your project. But so the volume of your content can be a problem here. If you have a tremendous amount of content, tremendous amount of nodes, it's going to affect your build time. And that's where that incremental build thing can be important. Gatsby doesn't do incremental builds right now, but they're working on it. It's kind of high priority. It seems like it might be like a service that they offer or something, but that is really going to impact whether or not this is practical for you, your build time and how often people are changing content. There's also the preview experience. So you're not going to have necessarily a traditional preview experience if the static site you're building is not in Drupal or not your Drupal site. So that could be a problem depending on how important that is for your content editors. There's ways around that. I mean, you can trigger builds in hosting options so you can actually see your deploy preview, go look at it. But there's still time. You still have to go somewhere else to see the build. I know that some of these modern options, they're also working on kind of options there. So hopefully that'll get better as time goes on. But then also things like forms, right? Heavy use of the form API. That might be a reason that it might not be right to do this statically. Although, I would challenge you there to try to think differently about it, right? If the thing that's causing you to hesitate is the fact that you have one contact form, you can definitely do that. There are a lot of hosted ways you can do it. A lot of these hosting providers like Netlify, they offer their own form options. So if that's the only thing blocking you, you just have to weigh the benefits. But if you have a bunch of really custom forms in Drupal, maybe this isn't right for you. Authentication and authenticated content is also another thing that kind of pushes you away from the static view of things. There are ways to handle authentication. But if it's a heavily authenticated with custom content based on roles, again, this might not be the right solution for you. And then the politics thing, I put that there just because it's something that I dealt with recently. And politics sounds negative, but it's going to change how the process works and what people are used to as far as how they enter in their content, preview their content, how long it takes for it to become available, how dynamic and fluid it is. So, depending on the people that are working on the site, the requirements of the project, that might be a bit of a challenging barrier to get over. But in general, especially the more I use and enjoy some of these options, I would encourage all of you to also kind of challenge your perceptions here and ask yourself, why can't this be something that is static? And I think there are a lot of cases where something that you've thought of as dynamic in the past could certainly be static, or parts of it could be static. I challenge you to kind of think about and rethink that. And just kind of the other thing, going through this, I wasn't able to put it together for today, but based on some of these resources and how they work with Drupal, it seems like I should probably build a static site that has some of this content. So hopefully maybe it's something I can do in the future if people are interested in it. All right. Wow. Right on the suggested time. So I definitely have time for questions if anybody has them. Yes?
So as you try to integrate maybe more complex sites and get them to become more static based. If you need some dynamic pieces, is it, you can have the markup generated statically with some API calls potentially just to fill in, a few pieces of dynamic content. Is that typically how it would work as you get more complex?
Yep. Yeah. The question was for like more complex sites. Would that be handled by having, like the bulk of the content generated statically and then dynamic portions that like hit APIs? That's definitely true. And like Gatsby is probably the best example of that and kind of the way they think about it, in that at the end of the day, it's React and it's all React components. So it's going to build a lot of things statically, but any of your components can then go out, hit APIs, function dynamically, change. So yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Not a question as much as a comment. As I think about some of the clients that we work with, some of them have high security concerns.
Yep.
Their production server basically is connected to a staging server that's IP whitelisted. So like the internal politics already are like, we don't actually publish on production. We publish on staging and we push to production. So something like this as a build step would make a lot of sense.
Yep.
And save a lot of the caching layers, as you mentioned, that are on top of everything. Potentially making production serving a lot more cost effective.
Yep.
So that's sometimes you have a client like that, and that might make sense.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of great advantages from a security perspective with this approach. Yeah.
So with these, it's probably not an issue, but I'm wondering, so like if it generates the static versions of the content of your Drupal site using your theme, how does it not do that with the admin pages so that you don't have to worry about like static versions of admin?
Yeah, the question was, and from the perspective of Tome, when it does a static build of your Drupal content, how does it, know to not do that for the admin? I have no idea, but I don't think it does. Yeah, that'd be something interesting to look into.
If it's exporting content though, and like nodes, your admin pages aren't.
It probably uses just your node table and goes through. I'm assuming.
Well, you must do more than that because you can have modules that generate page output that are content that aren't node-based or entity-based.
Does it export that?
I don't know.
I'm assuming it would, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's where the gray area between if you have admin modules that kind of do that, and then modules that do that.
Yeah, and also,
There's things for it.
yeah, and I would imagine it doesn't work with everything. I'm sure there are like interesting modules and weird cases where it's not quite ready to handle it yet. But yeah, it's a good question. How exactly does the magic work? Yes.
So after VadCamp, I tried installing Gatsby with the Drupal source plugin, and when I tried the npm install for the Drupal source plugin, it worked. So have you actually succeeded in getting past that?
Yes, I have. So I also did a little bit of that in prep for this presentation. I was actually going to submit an issue. So there's one issue with the question was, I tried to use the Drupal source plugin and it blew up. There's an issue with the dependency in the using Drupal project. It just needs to be changed. It's a different version of the Drupal source plugin. So that might be the only issue. But also, I think some things have changed in Gatsby v2, which was released somewhat recently. And I'm not so sure that they went up and updated all of the example projects yet. But I have used it with the v1 of Gatsby. I currently use it on my blog with the Drupal source plugin. So, I've gotten it to work. Yep, with Gatsby 1. Yeah, so I think there just might be a few bugs there. Yeah, I'll try to submit an issue for that because it would be obviously great if that Drupal example worked for the people who try it. Cool. Anything else? Heard a lot of interested so that's good. That's what this was all about. So, yes.
So this, you may have mentioned this already. While you're going through this, I'm thinking, so for static sites that are simpler, there's the basic page that's static, HTML, and you could do things with it in Drupal, right? Different theme layers and stuff like that. But what would be the selling point for the magic that could happen with one of those over that very simple tool
Yeah, so the question, and let me know if I recap this correctly, but like what is the selling point of using a static site generator to build a static version of your Drupal content or something like that, and not just using the static thing that Drupal generates? Yeah. Part of the reason is that the Drupal version of it isn't really static, at least from my perspective anyway, in that,
Page.
First of all, for a Drupal site, you have to have this whole stack. You have to have your whole LAMP stack that has a database. It has, PHP and Apache, and is all hosted somewhere. And then there is like a cached version of that page, but it takes some time to get there, right? The first time that it's rendered, it is not static. And then, but eventually it's cached, and you may have additional layers in front of it, like varnish, that do make it static. But it takes a whole lot to get there, and you have to have hosting infrastructure to get there. So I think the advantage is that you just cut all that stuff out, and you start with a thing that is only static and can only be static. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's kind of a decoupled front end. Really.
Yeah. Yep. The comment was that it's kind of a decoupled front end, and it definitely is. Yep. And what I liked about these three particular options is that it kind of runs the gamut of that. Like there's JEKYLL's a pretty simple templated static thing. Gatsby is definitely more decoupled, more of a decoupled front end, and then Tome is more of just a static version of what you can do in Drupal. So yeah, depending on what you want, it could be a decoupled front end. It could be a little bit more static and Drupal-y. Cool. Anything else? Awesome. Oh, one more.
Where do we get the slides?
They're on the node, the session node.
Oh, great. All right.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.